Daniel Robitaille was born on January 17, 1865 at 6 p.m. at the Esplanade Plantation in New Orleans. He was the son of two slaves, Thea Bee and Wendell Robitaille, but slavery was abolished just 2 weeks after his birth. After the American Civil War, his father, Wendell, made a considerable fortune after designing a device used to mass-produce shoes. So Daniel was sent to all of the best schools and grew up in what was known as polite society. He developed a prodigious talent as an artist, and in his adulthood, many other wealthy people hired him to create portraits for them, which were meant to document their wealth and be a sign of their position in society. One of these commissions came from a wealthy landowner named Hayward Sullivan, who hired Daniel to capture his daughter's virginal beauty, as he puts it. Her name was Caroline Sullivan, and the only problem with this job is that her beauty did not stay virginal for very long. They fell in love, and in 1890, Caroline became pregnant, which was a big problem for her father, who was still transfixed by the legacy of slavery. After slavery ended, there was still a period of racial segregation, so Mr. Sullivan believed it was wrong for his white daughter to have a relationship with a black man. This was a hot-button issue at the time. It was the same year that Robitaille's home state of Louisiana passed the Separate Car Act, which required separate but equal train cars for black and white passengers, and this was just 4 years before the specific issue of interracial marriage would be addressed, when it would be outright prohibited in the state. But because there was no legal recourse at the time, Caroline's father hired some men to hunt Robitaille down and told them to get creative with the punishment. They finally tracked him down in an area in Chicago, Illinois that would eventually become known as Cabrini-Green. I'm not sure why Daniel and Caroline were living there when both are from New Orleans, but it stands to reason that Caroline's father was such a wealthy landowner that he had land in multiple states. Whatever the reason may be, Daniel Robitaille was caught by the men, and they proceeded to saw off his right hand and smear his body with honey stolen from a local apiary. People in town had gathered around to watch the torture, and one kid takes a taste from the honeycomb with his finger, resulting in the coining of Robitaille's iconic nickname, Candyman. And the whole crowd just starts chanting Candyman over and over. This is also the origin of one of Candyman's often repeated catchphrases. Sweets to the sweet! The line actually comes from William Shakespeare's Hamlet at the funeral of Hamlet's love interest Ophelia. Ophelia's mother is scattering flowers on her daughter's grave when she says the line. So this woman saying it during the lynching of Candyman is doing so in a mocking way. And that's when the huge swarm of bees located their stolen honeycomb and furiously attacked the man covered in their honey. Robitaille was stung to death by the bees. But it's said that Caroline's pain was even greater than his own. He promises that his captors will all be damned, as her father contemptuously holds her mirror up to his face to show him the monstrosity that he had become, claiming Caroline wouldn't even look at him now. Daniel Robitaille's last words are Candyman, as he passes away while staring into the mirror. But something happened that day, and when Caroline retrieves the mirror, she sees his soul captured inside of it. Witnesses said the lynching was so agonizing that his soul was trapped inside the mirror.
This man couldn't lash out in life, but in death that hate, that evil was strong enough to bring him back, to reclaim what was taken away.
Sullivan's men then burned his body on a giant pyre and scattered his ashes around the area. Caroline still honored his memory at a mausoleum in their home state, inscribing the words, "My beloved, may you suffer no more." But this turned out to be anything but the case.
His resurrection began as rumor and grew into myth. Say his name 5 times in the mirror and he would appear. The myth has traveled from place to place, taking root in the most desperate areas.
His last name actually references the virally spreading stories and rumors about his legend. Robitaille is a French word meaning bright and famous. To learn how Candyman's tale inspired a slew of similar legends, the true story of Candyman from our world, and the often overlooked true meaning of Candyman, stick around to the end of this video. This video is sponsored by Rocket Money. I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the horror history classroom. Welcome to another episode, by the way. Finally, a horror history episode that isn't about a robot or a clown. Candyman originated in a 1985 short story called The Forbidden by Clive Barker, 1 year before making the novella that went on to become Hellraiser. The story is set in a decaying housing project in Liverpool, England, where the protagonist, Helen, is researching urban legends for her thesis. Yeah, take a seat in the horror history classroom, Helen. She stumbles upon the legend of Candyman, who becomes a menacing and deadly presence. The story tackles themes about folklore's ability to take a life of its own, and fittingly, he seems to be a combination of real urban legends like Bloody Mary and the Hookman. In 1992, director Bernard Rose adapted the story to film, this time being set in Chicago, transforming the original story's themes about the British class system to issues of racial segregation in the ghetto. Just as the legend of the Candyman grew through various retellings of the story in the movie, the character expanded through pop culture in our world with the release of 3 sequels: Candyman Farewell to the Flesh in 1995, Candyman Day of the Dead in 1999, and Candyman 2021, because subtitles are so out in the 2020s. The actual chronology gets a little more confusing than that, but of course I will be sorting all of that out in this video. Outside of the canon, the character has become kind of the face of urban legends in general, being parodied in South Park,
Biggie Smalls, Biggie Smalls, Biggie Smalls.
What the f is this? Hey!
and receiving the honor of being the epic closer to Ice Nine Kill's Silver Scream 2 album.
Everything's bittersweet when you're the Candyman.
A single listen will guarantee that you'll get hooked. But to fully understand the buzz surrounding the Candyman, we've got to take it back to the legends that inspired his creation. Candyman began appearing to anyone who dared say his name 5 times into the mirror, not just Caroline's mirror, but any mirror. When he appeared, his severed hand would be replaced by a sharp hook, and he would be covered in bees, just as he had in his final moments. These elements bring to mind a number of real-world urban legends. Bloody Mary is an English myth based on Queen Mary I, who ruled in the 1500s and executed over 200 Protestants during her reign, earning her the infamous nickname. Legend has it that if you stare into a mirror alone with only a candle's light and recite the name of Bloody Mary 3 times, you'll see her spirit appear in the mirror behind you. There are many different versions of the story thanks to narrative drift, so if you've heard a version where you have to say the name 13 times, or a version where the ghost is actually that of a woman who committed suicide, that's probably why. Candyman's story also gets skewed by multiple retellings over time. In fact, other than that, there are a number of other similarities with Candyman. The obvious one is the summoning by mirror recitation, but one of the reasons that Bloody Mary is so popular at sleepovers is because sometimes the person performing the ritual really does see Bloody Mary. Or at least, psychologists think they do. Staring at a dimly lit mirror for an extended period of time can lead to something known as strange face illusions. This is a phenomenon that's really been tested and confirmed in 58% of patients. It could be a combination of face pareidolia, or the ability for our brains to see faces in everyday objects, and the power of belief. If the person really believes that they're going to see Bloody Mary in the mirror, then they might actually hallucinate something. Whatever the case, the result is that only the person in front of the mirror will be able to see her, and Candyman is treated in a similar way, using this to his advantage to psychologically manipulate his victims. There's also the fact that Queen Mary's portrait is kinda freaky and goes unnecessarily hard, much like Candyman's self-portrait. The other urban legend that seems to have inspired the Candyman mythos is the Hookman, a killer with a hook for a hand who attacks people in parked cars. The Hookman is often depicted in a raincoat, giving him a similar silhouette to the Candyman, who can be seen wearing this big, low-hanging fur coat. Of course, the names are also similar if you want to put any stock into that, Hookman and Candyman. But Candyman is less about adapting and changing existing legends and more about how hysteria gives birth to new ones. Shortly after Daniel Robitaille's lynching in 1890, his lover Caroline would give birth to a daughter, Isabel, beginning the lineage that would span for many generations. If there's anything that scares me more than the various urban legends that I've discussed up to this point, it's seeing extra money coming out of my bank account. I recently discovered that I was being charged twice for the same subscription. This very well could have broken me financially, but luckily I teamed up with Rocket Money to sponsor this video. Rocket Money is the personal finance app that helps you cancel subscriptions, lower bills, and better manage your money. I love using Rocket Money because it's too easy for me to get caught up in making content and not realize how much money I could be saving. Canceling unwanted subscriptions is easy. The app automatically identifies recurring subscriptions and makes it easy to cancel in-app with just a couple taps. Rocket Money has helped save its customers an average of $720 a year with over 500 million in canceled subscriptions. The app also has other features like smart budgeting, which will analyze your spending habits and create a custom budget that works with your lifestyle. It will automatically monitor your spending by category and notify you when you've exceeded your limits. You can get started for free, so there's no reason not to try this out and make sure that your finances are in shape. Just go to rocketmoney.com/CZsWorld to get started. That's rocketmoney.com/CZsWorld to take control of your finances today. Daniel Robitaille was not the only person to find himself incorporated into the Candyman mythos. After the end of slavery in the United States, racism and segregation continued to rear its ugly head. In 1922, a man named William Bell was arrested under suspicion of attacking a white woman and was lynched by an angry mob before he got to trial. This is a real thing that happened. There's even a memorial for him, but in the 2021 movie, William is mentioned as one of 4 men whose pain was incorporated into the Candyman legend. It's possible that William was not actually summoned as a spirit like the others, but rather was just metaphorically represented by Candyman. This guy, at first, implies that Candyman is just a made-up legend that represents the tragedies that have occurred due to prejudice. Basically, that people created Candyman to cope with all of the violence so that they could have something to blame. But eventually, it becomes clear that there are other spirits outside of Daniel Robitaille that can be summoned by saying Candyman's name. So in William's case, we don't know for sure. Shortly after, a neighborhood of 2-story row houses was built in Chicago, and the area became known as Cabrini-Green in 1942. The name Cabrini-Green makes it sound like some kind of paradise with grass and trees, but that was anything but the case. It's actually a combination of two last names, Francis Cabrini and William Green. Cabrini-Green became a ghetto, and it was set up in such a way that it was cut off from the wealthier sections of town.
Got the highway and the L train to keep the ghetto cut off.
Cabrini-Green is almost an architectural extension of the segregation that began the Candyman legend in the first place. Daniel Robitaille was forced to separate from his white lover, and the residents of Cabrini-Green were being geographically separated from the rest of the city. The next Candyman would face similar discrimination. His name was Samuel Evans, and it's said that he was run down during the white housing riots in the 1950s. As far as I can tell, Samuel Evans is fictional, but the events being referred to here are based on a series of real events. The most well-known was the Cicero race riot of 1951. Basically, this huge mob went crazy, all because this one black family was moving into an apartment building, and the Illinois National Guard had to be called in. Again, all of the conflict is centered around segregation. In 1957, the mid-rises and high-rises were built in Cabrini-Green, and quickly became a symbol of very poor living conditions and crime. And this would be where whispers about the Candyman really started to take off. It would be difficult to say for sure how many were killed by the vengeful spirit, because again, Candyman was both a real dangerous ghost with the ability to kill those who summoned him, and a metaphor and scapegoat for inner-city violence in general. If there was an unsolved murder in Cabrini-Green, it was often blamed on Candyman, regardless of whether or not the ghost of Daniel Robitaille was responsible. From 1942 to 1987, 21 such incidents were attributed to Candyman, according to local newspapers. In 1977, we got our fourth Candyman, a man named Sherman Fields.
He had a hook for a hand. Neighborhood character used to stand out there and hand out sweets to us when I was a kid.
I know Sherman was maybe just trying to be a nice guy by handing out candy, but maybe, just maybe, if you live in a neighborhood haunted by a vengeful spirit named the Candyman, and you just so happen to have a hook for a hand, just like Candyman, maybe it's not the smartest idea to go around handing out sweets.
One October, a razor blade shows up in a little white girl's Halloween candy. Police come around here looking for Sherman, but Sherman's gone.
Sherman must have known that this was not a good look for him, and began hiding out in the walls of the apartment complex, where he became a bit of an urban legend himself among the neighborhood kids.
I hope Sherman gets you.
And one October morning, he emerges from a hole in the wall of the laundry room and offers candy to a boy named William. Which, I'm not saying he deserved what happened to him, but he has to realize that coming out of a wall and offering candy in the area known as Candyman country is kind of creepy. Due to the stories, young William seems to agree that it's creepy, and he screams, and Sherman is caught and beaten to death by police. But like Robitaille and presumably the others before him, he was innocent, and his soul is intertwined in the Candyman folklore. His name disappeared from the stories over the years, and he was simply known as Candyman. And when William's sister eventually called Candyman's name, he was the one to take revenge on her. It may seem like it's getting kind of confusing since we now have 4 different people who are all known as Candyman, but if you think about it, this tends to be how real urban legends go. As the story is passed from generation to generation, details get changed and bias from each time period creeps in. It's not that different from the legend of Bloody Mary. Depending on who you ask today, people might tell you that Bloody Mary is one of a number of people, including Queen Mary I of England, an American serial killer named Mary Worth, Hungarian serial killer Countess Elizabeth Bathory, or even a Salem witch trial victim named Mary from the early modern era. I honestly don't know how Elizabeth Bathory's name got in the mix because her name isn't even Mary. It might just be one of those things where 2 different urban legends merge with the passage of time, much like Sherman Fields and Daniel Robitaille. Also, quick timeline note about Sherman Fields. At one point there was an article claiming that he died in 1970, but I'd have to trust the title card that claims it was 1977. The title card is always all-knowing. And to back this up, there's a flyer at an art gallery that claims that it happened in the late 70s. This may be a continuity error, but I choose to look at it as another example of the nature of folklore. As retellings continually reshape a story, you end up with different versions that have different details. We see the same effect happen all the time in the news today. I recently watched a video from a creator named Upper Echelon where he compares the modern news cycle to the children's game Telephone. In Telephone, you start with one phrase and each kid whispers it to the kid next to them, and once you get all the way around the circle, the original phrase is often changed entirely. And in his video, he talks about how the same thing is happening with news publishers writing articles on other news publishers' articles, and then journalists getting their info secondhand from those articles, etc., etc. And you end up with the original statement being completely changed or exaggerated due to the bias in how each writer interprets the message of the previous writer. So the same thing seems to be going on in Candyman. In 1981, Philip Purcell, an anthropology professor at University of Illinois Chicago, or UIC for short, wrote a paper on Candyman, which didn't exactly help the legend die. At some point, most likely in the mid-80s, a gang leader started terrorizing the neighborhood, calling himself Candyman. While we don't know exactly what his motivation was, I imagine that he thought some non-skeptics would come to believe that the angry spirit of Daniel Robitaille was the one committing his heinous crimes. And that's essentially what happened on the particularly disturbing April 22, 1987.
Well, all I know was there was some lady in a tub and she heard a noise. I think her name was Ruthie Jean.
When Ruthie Jean called the police, they didn't believe her, giving ample time for the gangster to break into her apartment through the medicine cabinet that conjoined her bathroom to the vacant unit next to hers. She was later found to have been killed with a hook. And if that idea isn't disquieting enough, it may not bring you any comfort to learn that this actually happened. Ruthie Mae McCoy was a real woman who was killed in Chicago after a man came in through her medicine cabinet, and she was the inspiration for the identical crime that took place in the original 1992 film, Candyman. Ruthie McCoy's name was kind of split into two characters: Ruthie Jean, the woman who was killed in her apartment, and Anne-Marie McCoy, her neighbor who later faces some horrors of her own at the expense of her infant son. Ruthie Mae McCoy also had schizophrenia. In Candyman, the protagonist, Helen, is made to look like she has schizophrenia by Candyman to hide his involvement and make her look guilty. This creates a direct link between the mental illness and the Candyman mythos. In real life, police didn't believe Ruthie when she called 911 because they knew she had schizophrenia, but in the movie, they didn't believe her because they didn't believe in Candyman. A reporter for the Chicago Reader discovered that bathroom cabinet break-ins were quite common and well known by residents of the Abbott Homes apartments, where McCoy lived. Apparently, the bathroom cabinets had been installed back-to-back with a 2-foot wide pipe chase running between the apartments. They were loosely attached to the walls with just 6 flimsy nails to make it easy for plumbers to access the pipes for repairs. The newspaper in Candyman tells an almost identical story, with, of course, a few key details changed. The killer or killers of Ruthie Jean smashed their way through the back of the medicine cabinet in the small apartment bathroom. The attack took place at the Cabrini-Green housing project. This mysterious attack brings the total of unsolved murders in the housing project to an alarming 26 just this year. It's interesting how the headline says what killed Ruthie Jean and not who killed Ruthie Jean. While the gangster posing as Candyman built fear in the community without summoning the real thing, the legend was also alive and well outside of Cabrini-Green. One particularly chilling example happened in the late 80s, maybe 1988.
Happened a few years ago near Moses Lake in Indiana.
A babysitter named Clara is visited by a guy she has the hots for named Billy and challenges him to try summoning Candyman, but stops him short of saying his name the 5th time. After he goes downstairs, she, for unknown reasons, completes the ritual by reciting the name for the 5th time.
Candyman.
When she turned off the lights, she saw him standing there behind her. Her blood leaked through the ceiling, and Candyman killed the baby too. Billy survived, but his hair turned white from shock. This brings up a few questions about the rules around summoning Candyman. In this instance, we learn a few things. Number 1, it doesn't have to be the same person saying the name each time. Whoever says it the 5th and final time will be considered the summoner, and that'll be the person who faces his wrath. Number 2, there doesn't appear to be a time limit. You can pause as long as you want between each Candyman, which people love to do. There's always a ridiculous dramatic pause before saying it for the final time. In fact, the 5 declarations of the name don't even have to be consecutive. You can interrupt the ritual with other dialogue, but the say my name counter doesn't stop. Around this time, there was also another story involving a handicapped boy who was killed by Candyman in a public restroom in Cabrini-Green while his mom was shopping across the street. When a man went in to check on him, it said that his hair also turned white. This boy was most likely a victim of the gangster posing as Candyman, not the supernatural Candyman himself. Then there's the most notable victim, a graduate student at UIC named Helen Lyle.
Cabrini-Green, Chicago, 1992.
Yeah, I'm gonna ignore this newspaper headline from 1991 and assume that the guy who wrote a book on Candyman has his dates correct. 1992 it is. Helen and her classmate, Bernadette, are working on a project on urban legends. She's also married to a professor, Trevor, who teaches a class on modern folklore. On the board, you can see some of the common elements that he's identified in neighborhood legends. Some, if only a little basis in truth. Often a victim seeking revenge resides in a forbidden area, sometimes to keep children from the area. This is also probably a reference to the original short story. And deformities in appliances, blades, hooks, etc. These are obviously all traits that apply to the Candyman legend, but he sees these urban legends as more of a reflection of societal fears rather than a supernatural phenomenon, which is basically what Candyman is in our world. We have a term for that here in horror history: cultural legendizing. Candyman is a metaphor for racial segregation in the same way that Godzilla represents nuclear fallout, the Demogorgon represents fears of communism, and La Llorona represents issues in Central American marriage practices.
See, these stories are modern oral folklore. They are the unself-conscious reflection of the fears of urban society.
As part of her research, Helen talks to a woman familiar with the story of Ruthie Jean, and when Candyman is brought up, she becomes visibly uncomfortable. She eventually discovers that her own apartment was originally supposed to be a housing project with the same layout as the building in Cabrini-Green, and after replacing her mirror, her and Bernadette recite the illicit name into it 4 times, but notably, only Helen completes the ritual by saying the fifth, after a 4-second pause for dramatic effect, of course. However, Candyman does not act against Helen immediately. The next day, they go to visit the actual apartment where Ruthie Jean lost her life in Cabrini-Green, and they're instantly spotted and suspected to be policed by the locals. They discover graffiti referencing the original legend, and a huge painting of Robitaille in what's left of Ruthie Jean's former apartment. She also finds a pile of candy, one of which contains a razor blade. Could this mean that someone in the building is the actual criminal who framed Sherman Fields? I think that may be the case. Fields passed away in 1977, and Ruthie Jean's apartment wouldn't have been vacated until 10 years later, meaning that this candy was placed here well after his death. This is where Candyman first approaches Helen, however she doesn't realize it until later when reviewing the photos. On the way out, they meet a woman named Anne-Marie McCoy, who explains that she heard Ruthie screaming through the wall the night of the murder and dialed 911, but nobody came. Anne-Marie claims that she's scared for her son because they're never going to catch Candyman. Helen would later go back alone and meet a boy named Jake, who refuses to talk out of fear that the Candyman will get him. He does, however, lead her to the bathroom where the other young boy was once killed. She finds more Sweets to the Sweet graffiti, and all of the toilets are destroyed except for the last one, which is completely filled with bees. She doesn't know it yet, but this is the first hallucination that she's seeing as a result of Candyman's influence. Actually, I'm not sure if hallucination is the right word. When someone summons the Candyman, he or she can see the spirit and the colony of bees that come with it, but others cannot. However, they're not hallucinations. Candyman's hook really can pierce, and the bees really can sting. One thing that is definitely not a hallucination or spirit of any kind is the gang leader who's been going around calling himself Candyman. And when he shows up and traps her in the bathroom, it's bad news for Helen Lyle. She's lucky to survive his attack, but one silver lining is that the police are finally able to arrest the man who killed Ruthie Jean. Nobody was willing to testify against him until now. Once he's arrested, belief in the Candyman around Cabrini-Green reaches an all-time low, which prompts him to finally make his presence known to Helen, as she's reviewing photos in the university parking lot.
Do I know you?
No, but you doubted me.
Once Helen realizes who he really is, Candyman explains that he was obliged to come because she didn't believe in the legends.
I am the writing on the wall, the whisper in the classroom. Without these things, I am nothing. So now I must shed innocent blood.
Essentially, he's saying that he must continue to kill in order to keep his legend alive, but contrary to what you would expect based on his behavior so far, he doesn't kill Helen. Instead, she wakes up in the bathroom back at Anne-Marie's apartment where she finds the dog beheaded and the baby, Anthony, missing. Before long, police storm in and apprehend her. So why does Candyman frame her instead of just killing her? This will become more evident throughout his story, but I think Candyman sees something in Helen that reminds him of his love from 1890, Caroline. He doesn't just want to kill Helen, he wants her to join him. But we'll get into that a little bit later. After she's bailed out of jail, he appears to her again by punching through her medicine cabinet. This method of entry is symbolic. It's the same way that Ruthie Jean's apartment was invaded 4 years ago. He's getting back at her for making people believe that Candyman isn't real.
Your disbelief destroyed the faith of my congregation.
It's interesting how he references his followers as his congregation, giving it a religious undertone. It's not the only religious parallel I noticed. His outfit almost makes it look as if he's wearing clergy robes, and non-diegetically, the gospel music that we hear when he's around makes it feel as if he's constantly being followed by a church choir. There will be more religious references, but I think the main takeaway is that he's being used to show the similarities between organized religion and urban legends. Both are supported by the belief of the congregation. Candyman makes Helen an offer, giving the option for Anne-Marie's baby to die in her place. That's when her friend Bernadette arrives, lets herself in, and is shocked to come face to face with Candyman, who rips her apart, casting further guilt on Helen when her husband comes home and finds the carnage. Helen is committed to an insane asylum, and on the way there, he speaks to her again, trying to convince her that she's better off trying to gain immortality by becoming an urban legend herself.
To be whispered about at street corners, to live in other people's dreams, but not to have to be.
She also has visions of where he's hidden the baby and prays to God not to let him kill it. Again, we're seeing the contrast in her religion, which she has no trouble accepting due to her social background, and Candyman, something she initially didn't believe in, which is what landed her in this mess in the first place. At the hospital, she's tied down with arm restraints, and Robitaille floats above her, where some of his motivation starts to come out.
accept what the bad teach them by their excesses. Allow me at least to kiss. Just one exquisite kiss.
This is more evidence that Helen has become a stand-in for Caroline Sullivan. The line almost sounds like something that Robitaille might have said to Caroline in the beginning of their romance. He knew that the relationship would be forbidden because of society's views towards interracial relationships in the 1800s, but he's trying to convince her to give him just that one kiss. Helen tries crying for help, but nobody else can see Candyman, which makes it look like she's schizophrenic. She ends up sedated on Thorazine, completely unaware of the passage of time, and we can see Candyman keeping the baby alive during this time by feeding him what I assume is honey from the tip of his finger. A month goes by before Helen is finally woken up again, and for the first time, she demonstrates her full belief in Candyman by attempting to summon him using the side mirror in an attempt to prove that he really exists and she's not crazy. Before saying Candyman for the final time, she pauses 11 seconds for dramatic effect. Although Candyman does appear, he doesn't do her any favors in proving her innocence as she had hoped, because he shows up and tears through her psychologist with the hook. But again, he doesn't come after her, instead cutting off her restraints and flying out through the window, giving her the opportunity to escape and flee home, where she finds her husband has already replaced her with a younger woman from one of his classes. Although Candyman doesn't appear during this interaction, I still find it relevant to mention because it's another example of the rumors and whispers becoming reality. She had previously suspected Trevor of having an affair, but never fully believed it to be true. With nowhere else to go, she sneaks back to Cabrini-Green to reinvestigate the vacant apartment one more time and finds his lair illuminated in candlelight. This time, she climbs up to another room and finds Candyman sleeping in the ruins. She attempts to attack him with the hook she found, but he jolts awake and demands that she surrender herself if she wants to save the baby.
Surrender to me now, and he shall be unharmed.
There are definitely some undertones to the way that he says surrender as he strokes her face, which is somehow now covered in makeup. This doesn't make any sense because she wouldn't be wearing makeup after having awoken from 1 month of sedation in the psych ward. The way this is shot almost resembles an old romance movie, so I think it's all part of her transformation into the replacement for Caroline. After laying her down, she discovers her hand covered with bees, and he opens his robe to reveal his decaying torso playing home to an entire swarm. They pour out of his mouth as he kisses her, which is one of the more disturbing things ever when you consider that there was no CGI used for this. After their encounter, he places the baby in the middle of a huge pile up outside that was going to be used for a bonfire and leaves behind a message for Helen over the portraits depicting his execution a century ago. It says, "It was always you, Helen," which I interpret as the strongest evidence that he's using her to fill the void left by Caroline. A cope 100 years in the making. Hearing the screams of the baby, Helen climbs into the pileup, and Jake, the boy who helped her before, sees the hook that she's holding and assumes that it's Candyman.
He's here.
This prompts the neighborhood kids to douse the pile in gasoline and begin the fire, and everyone gathers around, hoping to watch the evil that has long haunted their community burn. Helen does make it to the baby, but Candyman appears behind her and attempts to trap her in the fire. She's able to reach a burning spike and jam it into his chest. He screams and thrashes as the structure around them crumbles, but Helen is able to power her way out with the baby and deliver him back to his mother before finally succumbing to her burns. The Candyman goes up in flames and explodes into an eruption of sparks and, judging by the sound, bees. That would be the last we'd see of him in 1992. The religious subtext is referenced one more time as the entire neighborhood visits Helen at her funeral, demonstrating how they see her as a hero now and their belief in Candyman is restored. They all vow to never say his name again, but allegedly, someone broke the pact. And given how many people know about Candyman at this point, it was very unlikely that this would even do anything. There's always got to be that one kid who ruins it for the class. Helen also incarnates into a vengeful spirit of her own, but that doesn't really connect to Candyman going forward. But at some point, the anthropology professor Purcell writes a book on all of this called Candyman: A Century of Fear, and he goes on tour with it, prompting even more people to try reciting the cursed name. Other than Cabrini-Green in Chicago, one of the most popular locations that the legend is festered in is Daniel Robitaille's birthplace in New Orleans, Louisiana, where, in true Bourbon Street fashion, in the early 90s, he would leave 4 people laying face down in the gutter. Only, in this case, they were dead, not drunk. It would appear that Purcell's book inspired them all to test their luck by saying his name into the mirror. The first 3 victims' faces were so mutilated that they went unidentified by police. The 4th was Mr. Coleman Tarrant, who happened to be part of Robitaille's family tree. If you'll recall, Daniel and Caroline had a daughter named Isabel. She went on to have a daughter whose name we don't know, and her daughter was named Octavia. Octavia married Coleman and had 2 kids, Annie Tarrant and Ethan Tarrant. We don't know exactly when Coleman got the hook from Candyman, only that he got involved in the trafficking of stolen art on the black market as part of an attempt to obtain Caroline Sullivan's mirror. This was the same mirror that Robitaille's soul was trapped in, and he believed breaking it would break the curse and destroy Candyman forever. However, he was too late, and his son Ethan found him sacrificed in front of the Candyman painting in their old attic. Anyway, during Purcell's book tour, he shows a slide on Helen Lyle, who is now the latest chapter. This article appears next to a story titled, "Fleeing Militants, Bangladeshi Writer Arrives in Sweden." This is a real article from the New York Times, which was published on August 11, 1994, meaning that the New Orleans stop on Purcell's book tour must have been after that. More specifically, on February 25th, 1995, because the following day is stated to be
3 days until Lent.
And
it's only a couple of days until Mardi Gras.
One other note about this article, the newspaper states many believe she was killed by killer bees. Purcell's official version of the story also differs from what actually happened.
Helen Lyle becomes so obsessed by the myth that she takes on the persona of Candyman, killing her victims with a hook.
As part of a gag to entertain his audience, Purcell says Candyman 5 times into the reflective book cover, with a 5-second dramatic pause before the finale. Although the crowd is startled by the actor he hired to tear through the projector, it's not until late that night, after Purcell got into a scuffle with a disgruntled reader, that Candyman strikes, making it look like it was his attacker who came back for more. The man who's blamed for Purcell's murder is Ethan Tarrant, the great-great-grandson of Daniel Robitaille. From his perspective, his dad was killed by Candyman after reading Purcell's book, leading him to feel that Purcell is partially responsible. Ethan is arrested, and despite his attempts to stop his sister Annie from investigating the story, she probes their childhood home for clues and discovers the shrine to Candyman. The next day, February 27th, the topic comes up in the school that she teaches at, and she, like Helen, sees Candyman as a reflection, no pun intended, of societal fears.
Sometimes there are people in this world that do bad things, horrible things. And when they don't get caught, we start blaming imaginary monsters for their crimes. But that's all the Candyman is. An imaginary monster.
And by the way, Annie is an art teacher, a direct reflection of Robitaille, who is a professional artist. In order to prove to her students that he isn't real, she says his name 5 times in the mirror, making a dramatic 9-second pause before the final repetition. She boasts that nothing happened, but one of her students notices a bee continually flying out the window, which doesn't put him at ease. That night, she's in the bathroom cleaning up when she switches off the light and she comes face to face with Candyman for the first time. He repeats the same lines he used on Helen, but this time tells her that he cares for her and that they have a journey to make together. That's when he disappears into the other room and tears his hook straight through her husband's torso. She foolishly tries to retaliate by scratching him on the face, but this just works against her because it opens this crevice which the bees start crawling out of. She's unable to escape the apartment without him appearing before her, so eventually, just like Helen, she passes out. Her experience with Candyman is somewhat different though. He's not trying to mold her into his next lover because she's his great-great-granddaughter, and that would be weird. If something like that were to happen now or in the future. But he's still gonna use her to make people fear his name once more. The urban legend versus religion comparison is also back. As Annie heads home from the police station after giving her testimony, she sees religious protesters. Her entire investigation into her father's death is set in the backdrop of Carnival, which is a festive season in Christianity that occurs in the days leading up to Ash Wednesday, which marks the beginning of Lent. It's celebrated with parades, music, and street parties, with many masked attendees hiding their true identity. In this story, it serves as a parallel to Annie's family history, as she works to uncover the secrets of her relation to Daniel Robitaille, which has been hidden, or some might say masked, by her mother, who is ashamed of that part of their lineage. And perhaps because of this, she sees clues in her encounters with Candyman Dan. The following day is Mardi Gras, also known as Fat Tuesday, and she sees dreams or visions of Robitaille coming for her mom's throat. One of her students, Matthew, goes missing, and when she visits his neighborhood to offer help, she gets a lot of weird looks and hostility, not unlike what Helen experienced in Cabrini-Green. It's a sign of the distrust created by the legacy of segregation. She finally speaks to the boy's father, a pastor who explains that Matthew had been having nightmares, leading him to stay up all night painting these kinda creepy pictures of Robitaille and his lynching. The pastor refers to Candyman believers as turning to a false god, adding that he never thought that his son actually believed the stories. When asked about the possibility that he really exists, he doesn't offer much optimism.
Then only God can save us.
Annie continues to search for information about her father's final days, leading her to the French Quarter, where she learns about his conquest to find Caroline Sullivan's mirror, but this too is interrupted by a Candyman attack, leaving behind another body covered in bee stings. Annie tries reasoning with the hook-handed hasher, asking what he wants, and that's when he explains that Annie has a daughter growing inside of her, and offers a cryptic clue.
You cannot change who you are.
She hasn't figured out that they're related yet, so she just runs for it, with Candyman continuing to appear to her at various points in the parade. Meanwhile, at the police station, one of the cops tries to get answers out of Ethan. The officer attempts to summon the Candyman in order to prove that he's not real, one of the classic blunders in the Candyman franchise. His hesitation before saying Candyman for the 5th time is the best in the series, only 1 second. However, his lack of hesitation doesn't do him any good, and the cop is thrown through a second-story window, which has got to be the most epic kill in Candyman's history. Out of fear, Ethan tries to escape, and he ends up getting shot down by police. However, this time, there is security camera footage that kind of proves that Ethan was innocent, and convinces at least one detective that Candyman is responsible, because we see the cop lifted into the air and torn apart by an invisible force. Unfortunately, we don't know what becomes of this tape, such as if it ever gets out and seen by the public. If it did, it could be used to change the narrative behind Helen Lyle and many other Candyman attacks that have yet to happen. Belief is always the biggest hurdle, and most of Candyman's victims summon him just to prove that he isn't real, so this video could actually be of great value. However, this was 10 years before YouTube, so it's entirely possible that it was just thrown in an evidence archive and forgotten about. Or maybe it was released, but then people just assumed that it was staged and it ended up on one of those shows like Unsolved Mysteries where it would not be taken seriously. I will come back to this later because I think it's an important clue for a theory that I have not brought up yet in this video. Just trust me, have I ever let you down? Don't answer that. Regardless of what happens with the tape, Annie is about to find out the truth behind her family history, and it would lead to a spicy skirmish boiling over in the bayou. And I'm not talking about the gumbo. As Annie confronts her mother about the picture found in her drawer of Caroline and Isabel, her great-great-grandmother and great-grandmother respectively, she discovers that her connection to Daniel Robitaille's bloodline has been hidden from her for her entire life.
Your father was trying to destroy everything that we had by linking our name with that monster.
So you destroyed it instead, by denying the truth.
I am not a part of him!
We're his family!
No!
We're his blood!
I will not have him talk like that in this house.
You can't wash him away with a bottle!
There is no Candyman. He does not exist.
So once again, Candyman is the legendized version of racial segregation. Originally, he was the victim of segregation from his romantic relationship, but even now, over a century later, there are still people trying to distance themselves from their blood relationships. And Octavia is about to learn that blood is thicker than water, and steel hooks are thicker than an old woman's back. Got him. I just wanted to pause right here because this is one of the most epic neck tendon clenches I've ever seen. I don't even know if I could do that. That's good acting. Annie runs to her childhood home at the old plantation searching for Caroline's mirror, where she finally runs into Matthew, who had been hiding out there after seeing Candyman in his dreams. They realize the mirror must be hidden in the slaves' quarters, which Annie has never been to. But before she can grab it, Candyman appears to her one more time, warning her not to touch it.
The mirror is the secret of my strength, the keeper of my soul, the destiny of our family.
Why would you tell her that? I don't know. After telling her his story, he asks her to join him and go on to a world without pain. However, she instead goes for the mirror, which seemed to somehow be the only thing holding the place together from being ravaged by the storm raging on outside. Taking it causes the walls to collapse and the slave quarters to flood. Annie is rescued by her students, but when she reaches back to grab the mirror, Candyman emerges from the flood and tells her that the choice is no longer hers. However, she smashes the mirror, causing old Grandpa Dan to freeze in place and shatter into pieces, leaving his hook, the only remaining remnant, to clatter to the floor. Where Helen had unsuccessfully banished Candyman in flame, Annie seems to find greater success washing away the curses of his past in flood. This also marks the beginning of Lent. In Christianity, from my understanding, Lent is where you give something up that you love for 40 days. I remember when I was a kid, there would always be kids who gave up like pizza or something. What a sacrifice. While they were letting go of roughly 300 calories, in Annie's case, it's time to let go of the past. However, several years later, she would be sure to teach her daughter about their entire family history, including the interracial love story involving Daniel Robitaille. Justice for the relative who tried to kill you. She even named her daughter Caroline in honor of her great-great-great-grandmother. Personally, I have no idea who my great-great-great-grandparents are, and that seems a little excessive. I'm not gonna say if I'll have a kid in the future or not, but if I do end up having great-great-great-grandchildren, and if they are watching this video in the year 2160, all I'm saying is that if your content sucks, then I am going to haunt you. I have worked too hard to bring respect to this dynasty. When young Caroline sees the mirror on her mobile, she inexplicably starts chanting Candyman, but her mom comes in and stops her before saying the full phrase. And this symbolically marks the end of the Candyman cycle. Like the Robitaille slave quarters, which were washed away, many other elements of the legacy start to crumble. The Cabrini-Green high-rises were demolished over the course of 1995 to 2011 and replaced with luxury lofts and condos. Though the identity of the neighborhood was forever changed, there would be one holdover from the past. Remember Anthony McCoy? No? Actually, you do. Or if you don't, then you seriously need to go to the doctor. You need to go to the brain doctor. Anthony was the baby that Candyman abducted in 1992, who was saved by Helen Lyle. In 2019, a now 27-year-old Anthony has become, surprise surprise, an artist. One day, his girlfriend's brother tells the story of Helen Lyle, which he's not familiar with. His past has been kept from him by his mother. Also, we see how the story has changed over the years, with details like Helen doing snow angels in dog's blood, and her now being painted as the villain who tried to sacrifice the baby, rather than the hero who saved the baby and was celebrated by the community at her funeral. On Tuesday, May 15th, 2019, Anthony does some research about Cabrini-Green. The weekdays in this universe don't seem to match up with the weekdays in ours, but once again, if there's a title card like this, I'm gonna take that as gospel. Pun definitely intended. And I probably wouldn't use that word if I was not making the pun. While taking a photo, he's stung on the hand by a bee. You could interpret this as a coincidence, but it seems like even though Candyman was shattered 24 years ago, his curse remains with Anthony years later. After meeting William, the kid who screamed at Sherman Fields, Anthony learns about Candyman and says his name in the mirror just to freak out his girlfriend. He pauses 8 seconds before the final repetition. I'm seriously starting to want these moments of my life back. It's really adding up after watching every Candyman movie. It's not entirely clear how it works, but with Daniel Robitaille being destroyed, this seems to summon the next man up, Sherman Fields. Or maybe Fields is just summoned because Anthony was the one to call him, and that's the version of the legend that Anthony is familiar with. Like, if you believe you're gonna see Sherman Fields in the mirror, then you'll see Sherman Fields. But if you believe you're gonna see one of the others, you'll see one of the others. If that's the case, it could be a depiction of people who see Bloody Mary because of their own imagination. They believe they're gonna see something, and they do. Anthony becomes obsessed with the Candyman legend and creates a whole art piece around it, but it seems like he's combining Helen Lyle's story with Sherman Fields, not realizing that they spawn from 2 separate Candymen. After the exhibition, 2 exhibitors who had put on the event decide to summon him, with only a 1.5 second delay on the last mention of the name. Good job, keeping it efficient. Anyway, Sherman Fields appears, she gets her throat slashed, and he is dragged by one leg and strangled in midair. Fields also appears to Anthony's girlfriend Brianna that night in what may or may not have been a dream, and to Anthony himself the next day, where he drops a razor-filled candy in an elevator. Going down, sir. Despite this and learning about the dead art dealers, Anthony doubles down on his work.
I'm expanding the work into a series. I'm hoping to do a solo show. All about Candyman. Spread the word.
Oh, I love that idea.
That's cause you're an idiot. Anthony also encourages this art critic to say Candyman's name. It's not clear if he wants her to die or if he's also just an idiot. It's here at the art critic's apartment where he sees himself as Candyman in a mirror, in a room filled with bees with his now infected hand on the same side as Candyman's hook. We've seen Candyman appear to his victims before, but we've never seen him appear as his victims. This is a clue that Anthony is now going down the same path that Sherman and several others did. He's slowly becoming a Candyman in his own right. He leaves the apartment unscathed, but his friend, the art critic, is not so lucky. Where the Daniel Robitaille incarnation of Candyman was associated with graffiti saying "sweets to the sweet," the Sherman Fields version would leave behind a different phrase, "say my name," which was also the title of Anthony McCoy's art piece. This is also the message left behind when 4 teenagers recite the Candyman name in the school bathroom and find themselves locked in and massacred one by one. By the way, the dramatic pause on this one is 4 seconds. The recent string of tragedies does seem to put a spotlight on Anthony's art, a similarity that he shares with Daniel Robitaille, whose paintings were preserved after his death, which we will get back to.
My board members are buzzing about McCoy's work.
Okay, enough with the bee puns, lady. Anthony visits his mom, who is squeamish around the mere mention of the word Candyman. He finds out she lied about where he was from to protect him from Cabrini-Green and the threat of being slashed open by an evil spirit's hook. Still, he decides to return to what remains of the old neighborhood to rediscover his past. Meanwhile, his girlfriend is looking for him and gets locked in the dry cleaning area at the laundromat and abducted by William, who essentially has come to worship the idea of Candyman and thinks the community needs a new Candyman as a means of coping with the injustices of their world or something.
But a story like that, a pain like that, lasts forever. That's Candyman.
Anthony's right hand has become more and more infected after the bee sting, which spreads to the rest of his body. And to speed up the transformation, William cuts off his hand and replaces it with a hook, planning to frame him and get him killed by police so that he can legendize as the next Candyman and live forever through the stories that are passed down. And sure enough, when the cops show up, they immediately strike down Anthony, who is just lying defenseless in his girlfriend's arms. There are a lot of things that have to happen perfectly for William's plan to work, and they do happen. Pausing for context, the way things worked out play on this idea of Candyman being a cycle of events rather than one singular story preserved over the years. Daniel Robitaille was a victim of prejudice around interracial relationships, and each of the next 3 Candymen were victims of racism that reflected their time period. Candyman 2021 came out in, drumroll please, 2021, which was 1 year after George Floyd was a notable victim of police brutality, so Anthony's death is emblematic of the era. There was also another notable police brutality victim earlier that year named Breonna Taylor. And there was this social media movement using the hashtag #SayHerName in order to put pressure on the police department to properly investigate the incident. This is almost certainly the inspiration for Candyman's new motto, Say My Name, and maybe even the reason that Anthony's girlfriend is named Breonna, spelled differently but pronounced the same as Breonna Taylor. Especially considering what's about to happen next. After Anthony is shot, one of the cops on the scene tries to get Breonna to change her story to save the other officer's reputation. Instead of playing his game, she uses his rearview mirror to utter the Candyman name 4 times, but we don't have to wait to see how long she pauses before the final one, because the cop finishes the job for her.
Candyman?
This summons the newest iteration of the Candyman, which appears at first to be Anthony, but he's got some familiar lines.
I am the writing on the walls. I am the sweet smell of blood on the street, the buzz that echoes in the alleyways. They will say I shed innocent blood. You are far from innocent, but they'll say you were. That's all that matters.
He takes revenge on 2 of the cops on the scene as more and more bees swarm around him, completely engulfing his head. He slashes the 3rd and final cop against the brick wall in the old Cabrini-Green and levitates before Breonna. But when the swarm of insects finally disperses, she finds herself staring into the face of Daniel Robitaille, the original Candyman who is finally back. We obviously haven't seen it go down like this before. As far as we know, when Sherman Fields came back as a vengeful spirit, he still looked like himself. I imagine the reason that Anthony merged with Daniel Robitaille is because he brought Candyman's name back to prominence through art, just as Robitaille originally made a name for himself through art. Could it also have something to do with Anthony being kept alive by Robitaille 27 years ago? Sure, we have no idea what the actual reason is, and it's never explained. But CZ, isn't it kind of your job to explain it? Yeah, but we literally have nothing to go off of, so all I can do is provide a few ideas, which I did. What I do know is that Robitaille seems to be weaker now that he's back and requires the will and cooperation of his victim more than ever. It's been a long time, but he hasn't forgotten about being bested by Annie Tarrant all those years ago, and she's his first known victim in the 2020s, but not before passing some advice onto her daughter just 2 hours before Candyman got to her.
You must destroy the myth. As long as people believe, as long as they call his name, he will always come back.
Annie's death was ruled as a suicide, and Caroline, now an adult, the last remaining member of her family, is the sole survivor of Robitaille's bloodline. It wouldn't be long before she had her own brush up against the old family tree, but when exactly does this happen? I had to get a little creative to figure it out. So remember how I said weekdays in the Candyman world don't match up with weekdays in our world? Because on Anthony's computer, we see that the date is Tuesday, May 15th, 2019, but in our world, May 15th is on a Wednesday. So the day of the week in Candyman will always be 1 day earlier. Well, in Candyman Day of the Dead, we hear this.
Saturday's Day of the Dead.
Day of the Dead begins on November 1st. I made calendars with the adjusted weekdays of the Candyman universe and found 4 possible dates where Day of the Dead falls on Saturday in their world. November 2015, November 2020, November 2026, and November 2037. Now, if you'll recall, Caroline was born in 1995, at the end of Candyman Farewell to the Flesh. So in 2015, she would be 20 years old, in 2020, she would be 25 years old, in 2026, she would be 31 years old, and in 2037, she would be 42 years old. The actress who plays Caroline in Candyman Day of the Dead was 31 years old at the time it came out, so it would appear here that it takes place in 2026. I have noticed a couple websites claiming that it's 25 years after Farewell to the Flesh, however, I am gonna stick with the evidence that is actually in the movies. Anyway, Caroline's friend Miguel is holding an art gallery in LA to show off the works of Daniel Robitaille, which Caroline has inherited. She wants people to appreciate Daniel Robitaille the artist, not exploit him for being at the center of the Candyman myth. Miguel understands marketing a little better than she does though. For example, I easily could have marketed this video as What Daniel Robitaille Taught Us About Urban Legends and Interracial Relations, a video essay, and gotten like 15 views, but I didn't do that, thankfully. But Miguel's promotional genius ends up bringing in a little bit more of an unsavory crowd, and things get a little out of hand. As Miguel tells his audience about Robitaille's origin story, we see this scene of him tied to a tree where his body is ravaged by bees at night, whereas before it appeared to be during the day and he was on the ground. You could look at this as a continuity error, but again, I choose to see it as an example of the nature of urban legends. It's like the telephone game I mentioned previously. Details get changed as it's passed from generation to generation. I choose to see the depiction featured in Candyman 2 Farewell to the Flesh as what actually happened because Annie seems to receive this vision directly from Candyman, whereas the depiction in Candyman 3 Day of the Dead is shown while an art dealer is attempting to tell Candyman's story, or at least the version of the story that he's heard. What we see here is just a visual representation of that. At one point during the evening, Miguel dares Caroline to prove that she doesn't believe in Candyman by calling his name into the mirror. She pauses a modest 3 seconds before completing the ritual, but she and the other guests are terrified when the mirror breaks and a hook-handed man storms into the gallery. This turned out to only be an actor that Miguel had hired for the event, but the curse that she brought upon herself was real. But nothing supernatural would happen until that night. Also, I'm not really sure what Miguel was trying to do here. It doesn't seem like having a raving lunatic apparently crash your gallery would help you sell more artwork. Maybe he's not the marketing genius that I made him out to be. That evening on the subway, Candyman's voice echoes through the tunnels, and she sees a swarm of bees approach as he floats in her direction and gives her the usual spiel.
Bee-lieve in me.
Bee-lieve? Please don't tell me that's another pun, please. Anyway, Caroline passes out, but the activity for that evening continues. He goes after Miguel and his date, a model who is literally smearing honey on herself with a honeycomb. You're just begging Candyman to kill you at that point, which he does, of course. Miguel gets the old hook, and the model is stung by bees, and it appears she might have gotten the sharp end of the hook as well, but I obviously can't show that. But I will show the message that he left behind on the wall, believe. This has been Candyman's main goal for a while now. It's been 136 years since this legend began, and despite there being evidence of his existence, it seems like nobody really believes in him or fears him anymore. It actually reminded me a lot of the episode that I did on Freddy Krueger. As the years go by, people stop being afraid, and these entities need people to believe in them in order to maintain their powers. We even saw something similar with Pennywise in It Chapter 2. I guess I'm finding that this is a pretty common trope in the horror genre, and honestly, this idea of belief giving an entity power could be rooted in reality. If you recall, at the beginning of this video, I discussed Bloody Mary and how some people who performed the ritual actually believed that they did see her in the mirror because they believed that they would see her. In a sense, she's literally only appearing to those who believe. Belief is her power. Caroline eventually discovers Miguel, and a duo of comically racist cops gets on the case. Here's a highlight reel.
Your kind's always up to something. Get back to your business, Miguel. And he goes and gets himself killed. Ay, caramba. Like you said, Jamal, why don't you go shoot some hoops?
Long story short, the paintings from the art gallery were all stolen on the night of Miguel's death, and his friend David, the actor who he had hired to crash the gallery, is a possible suspect. So he and Caroline team up to retrieve the paintings and clear David's name. But Caroline starts seeing more and more evidence of her great-great-great-grandpa Robitaille being more than just a doubted myth. She steps into the bathroom while David is asking around for info at a bar, where Candyman appears and shows her imagery of her dead mother.
Our stories shall be one destiny, one family, one blood.
And I can't decide if that comes off more like a Bob Marley lyric or more like a religious passage. Yeah, now that I think about it, One Love does have religious lyrics, and it's just my own fault that I associate it more with a tropical beach. But just the way that Candyman talks, he uses a lot of words that you might expect to find in a religious text. The word blood can just as easily refer to violence or sacrifice as it can to family connections and bloodlines. Caroline is supposedly the last survivor of his bloodline, and he's trying to get her to join with the rest of their family in death, so in this case, it kinda refers to both. This time, Caroline freaks out, having accepted the existence of the family phantom of fudgy and fruity snacks, so David takes her to see his grandmother, a curandera, or a healer of evil spirits in some Latin American cultures. She tells him that evil cannot exist without good, but her visions of Candyman are getting worse, as she sees a bee crawl out from a bloody red spot in the egg yolk. In this ritual, the egg is basically supposed to sweep up any bad mojo that might be attached to her. In another video, I think I described it as the spiritual equivalent of a paper towel picking up dirt off a surface in order to cleanse the subject. I think it's probably the first time we've seen anyone do anything to try to detach themselves from Candyman after saying his name in the mirror. It's a good idea, but it doesn't work, and Caroline asks David to stay with her until her roommate gets home so she doesn't have to be alone. This, of course, leads to them going to bed together, but at some point during this encounter, David is replaced with Daniel. That is, Daniel Robitaille. It was one thing when he was trying to kiss Helen Lyle in 1992, but dude, this is your great-great-great-granddaughter. Like, that's kinda weird. I don't really like it. I think the significance is supposed to be that there's an intimacy subtext because Caroline McKeever is named after Caroline Sullivan, his lover from when he was alive, but this is just a little less Louisiana and a little more Alabama, if you catch my drift. He tells her that he'll let David live only if she takes his place and becomes his victim. Basically the same offer that he made to Helen Lyle, allowing her to be the victim instead of the baby Anthony, but this time it's reversed. David has a young daughter who would be orphaned if something were to happen to him. Once again, Caroline passes out, and her roommate eventually finds her in the midst of a nightmare. When she wakes up, she's spouting off about how Candyman has taken David, but from Tamara's point of view, it looks like she's lost it.
I'm not crazy! I didn't say you were crazy, but you need to talk with somebody. You just need some help.
Yeah, I didn't say you were crazy. You just need to talk to a professional, because you're crazy. Candyman does have a way with making his victims look mentally unwell. He did the same thing to Helen, who got locked up in an asylum because of it, and to a lesser extent, he made Anthony McCoy look like he'd gone off the deep end too. You may have noticed at this point that this feels contradictory. If he wants people to believe in him, then why make his victims look crazy? It's working against his main goal. Would you be more likely to believe a ghost story from a crazy person or a sane person? This is probably the single biggest struggle that I had while crafting my analysis of this character. His actions don't seem to match up with his stated intention. At the end of the day, we don't have any explanation for this. I'm just left to assume that there's some kind of rule preventing him from providing hard evidence to get people to believe in him. Or maybe he only benefits from their belief in him if they don't actually have proof that he exists. One thing I kept coming back to is the security tape of him taking out the police officer in 1995. Shouldn't this have gotten a whole bunch of people to believe in him? Well, after going over all of my Candyman notes, I think I may have found the answer. One theme that has come up over and over throughout Candyman's sordid history is the comparison of how people see him as an urban legend and how devotees interact with religion. From his clothing, to his sermon-like monologues, to the many other references and religious subtext that I've pointed out in this video, I think the lack of definitive evidence provided to make people believe in him operates the same way as religion. Religion is all about faith. Followers of a religion may have a relationship with God, but it's never in the form of irrefutable proof that God exists, because that wouldn't be faith, that would just be like proof. It reminds me of this old meme pointing out how God is always intervening, talking to prophets, creating miracles, and delivering messages to mankind, but then after the invention of the video camera, he just never shows up again. Obviously, it's just a meme, it's just a joke. I think you can believe in God even if you don't see the biblical stories as literal events that happened. But the main point that I'm getting at here is that those who believe do so even without proof. And the point behind Candyman is that urban legends and supernatural hook-handed killers operate very much the same way. The mystery around the whole thing creates believers, whether it be Candyman, Bloody Mary, the Hookman, or any other urban legend, and this is what gives power to those legends. And this would also kind of explain why Candyman likes to have one victim in each movie that he keeps alive for most of it. He wants Caroline to believe in him and fear him, and it is her faith that will inspire others to do the same, and this is pretty much how it goes in every installment of Candyman. So Caroline's situation goes very much like Helen's did in '92. He kills her roommate, just as he kills Bernadette's. This gets Caroline arrested, just as Helen was arrested. Then he kills the police officer holding her captive, just as he killed the psychiatrist who kept Helen captive. Caroline is given the officer's keys so she can escape, just as Helen's restraints were cut loose so that she could escape. With nowhere else to go, Caroline goes to David's house and gets another blessing from his grandmother, who elaborates on the advice from earlier. She says evil cannot exist without good, and she must destroy good in order to destroy evil. This doesn't seem like very good advice, and Caroline interprets it to mean that she has to destroy the paintings of Caroline Sullivan. So she evades the police by blending through the day of the Dead celebration taking place in the streets, and Candyman tries to convince her to give herself up to him along the way, to her finally locating the gangsters who stole Daniel Robitaille's artwork. This new metal bassist looking guy claims that the paintings are haunted and he wants her to take them away, but oh no, it's a trap. She gets knocked out by a goth dude with a hook. Caroline's got it pretty rough, okay? She gets knocked out like every 20 minutes. She awakes to what appears to be a Marilyn Manson cover band, but soon finds out that it's actually not that at all. This is essentially Candyman's cult, gathered to perform a ritual to honor him for the Day of the Dead. This is the result of the religious figure aura that he's given off for his entire afterlife. He now has followers performing ceremonies in his honor, even if they are trying way too hard to sound edgy.
We had an epiphany at the gallery. His myth called to us, a reflection of the evil that created you.
Make sure you subscribe for new horrors every week. Otherwise, I'll feel black and empty inside. One of these Antichrist superstars gets the honor of summoning him in a broken mirror, taking a 5-second dramatic pause at the end. When he shows up, he does a lot of damage, ripping out the piercings of the leader before slashing his neck and presumably doing the same to all or most of the others. He makes one last offer to Caroline, proposing to let David live in exchange for her life, and overwhelmed by his presence, I guess even though she's seen him 6 times before this, she passes out. Again. Maybe it's time to see someone about that.
You need to talk to somebody. You just need some help.
And she wakes up, she finds a hook, and discovers the paintings of Candyman seemingly guarded by thousands of beads. But before she can find the courage to approach, she's distracted when she spots David, still alive, but hanging on a pair of industrial hooks, Bobby Dagan style. Since he is still alive, I'll assume that there's no issue with me showing this footage. But as she tries to save him, Candyman appears one last time and kind of confirms what I was theorizing about earlier, about him seeing Caroline as a metaphorical stand-in for his Caroline.
At last, I will have what was taken from me so many years ago. My dignity, my destiny, my blood.
And he kisses her. Or maybe she kisses him. Just goes to show that some things are better not kept in the family. But it is actually Caroline's family that pulls her out of this. She has a vision of her dead mother, causing her to change her tune, climb through the swarm of bees, and destroy the paintings of Robitaille and his girlfriend with, ironically, a hook, the tool that Candyman used to rip apart so many of his countless victims. She also knocks over some candles, setting the whole display on fire, just as Candyman was set ablaze all of those years ago. Burning the paintings also sets his spirit on fire, and he burns in agony once more. And Caroline feels that she has finally ended the 136-year legacy of the Candyman.
They all blamed someone else for your crimes. I destroyed you, your good and your evil. There's nothing left. There's no proof of your existence. I destroyed the myth. No one will ever call your name again.
Which honestly has got to be the most stupid and naive thing ever, because there's literally graffiti all over the place in multiple cities depicting the Candyman. Not to mention the book that was written by Purcell, countless news articles, but most importantly, multiple generations telling the tale via oral tradition. There's no way you could possibly wipe out a myth like Candyman, and even attempting to do so would most likely have a Streisand effect and bring even more attention to him. Police show up on the scene shortly after, and you know that this means that there'll be reports filed, and this will end up on the internet and just fan the fire of Candyman rumors. It seems like if you truly wanted to neutralize Candyman, the best way to go about it would be through narrative drift. For example, if you intentionally spread a bunch of rumors saying you only have to say the name 3 times, then that'll probably end up getting spread around, and a decent amount of people will believe it. I mean, saying the name 3 times works for Bloody Mary, Beetlejuice, and Biggie Smalls, so it seems kind of believable. That reminds me of this Clara post I saw one time that said, what would happen if you said Candyman, Beetlejuice, Bloody Mary 3 times in a mirror? And the person who answered it was just like, absolutely nothing. None of these beings even exist. Like, not even entertaining the fun part of the question. But yeah, your best bet would just be to intentionally change the legend over time so that it no longer resembles the original story, or just not acknowledge it, like what Ethan Tarrant tried to do. But at the end of the day, it takes more than one person to do either of those things, which means the legend will probably always persist in some form. So does that mean that we haven't actually seen the last of the Candyman? Maybe, but personally, I think his story has been told. There's not a whole lot that could really be added to it, and it's not really as relevant in a cultural sense as it was when Candyman was first created. The original Candyman highlighted how the racial segregation of the 1890s was still alive in a different form in the 1990s. Farewell to the Flesh brought back the idea, putting a spotlight on Octavia, who sought to erase any racial diversity in her family tree. Again, a pretty subtle theme about segregation. But now, as of recording in the 2020s, we're not that far removed from George Floyd being the biggest story in the world. And we already got a Candyman movie on the heels of that. It seems kind of like revisiting it again is just beating a dead horse. It's not like there still aren't bad people in the world, but the original Candyman was much more of a nuanced commentary, putting a spotlight on how segregation is still hiding in plain sight, and now it's kind of devolved into very on-the-nose references to literally some of the biggest news stories in the world. Candyman showed us how a new legend is born, but what started as a series about the nature of urban legends and the intersection of myth and reality has seemingly become more focused on reminding us about reality. Unlike Candyman's many victims, I'm not so sure we need to repeat his name for a 5th time. But to get the full picture on urban legends, what they have to say, and how they've been interpreted in horror movies, I've got a playlist lined up for you on Left with some other great examples. Remember to subscribe to CZsWorld for new horrors every week, ring the death bell for all notifications, and I will see you in the next one. Assuming we both survive.